it's this idea that sometimes when we sort of care so much about people, we don't want to hurt their feelings. We don't tell them the difficult thing, or we go the other side, what Kim is called obnoxious aggression, where we just say whatever the heck we want to say. But this goes to, what I think my sort of the reason I'm here is to integrate, to balance. So balancing, integrating the care personally, the challenge directly, and especially at work, we feel like we have to do one of these things or another.
Hey, welcome to Unlatched Mind. This is episode 50. My guest today is Amy Sandler. Amy is the Chief Content Officer over at Radical Candor. She also hosts the Radical Candor podcast and is a Candor Coach. Recently, I'd say a few months ago, I had just picked up a bunch of new books, sort of in the self-help, genre, if you will. And, I'm always searching how to become a better leader, a better employee, better employer, whatever, better, dad. I'm into the self-help stuff, always looking to learn new things, and always being reflective on how I could do things better. One of the books that was recommended to me was Radical Candor, and really fell in love with the concept, and it's just helped me tremendously since then. So I thought, hey, this would be an amazing podcast to do. So I reached out to Amy and her team, and the book's actually written by Kim Scott. It's a really, really good book. And part of Kim's team is I was put in touch with Amy Sandler, my guest today, and I really enjoyed talking to Amy. I hope you get a lot out of it. I certainly did. There's a lot of really good nuggets in this conversation. So anyway, with that, I give you Amy Sandler. Anyway, Amy, thank you so much. So I'm looking through your work, listening to a bunch of talks you've done, and I appreciate the content you had sent me. I feel like we'll circle around a couple things: the Radical Candor piece, and a lot of your mindfulness and meditation. I feel like you've found a way to weave those two things together to be complementary. And I could have maybe that was just my takeaway from your work, but it seems like you use the two to complement each other, which I thought was pretty cool. So. We'll just go there and see where it goes. But I think because there's a lot of lessons learned in everything that I've consumed from your stuff so far. But anyway, maybe a little intro. Who are you? We touched on your background a little bit there, but how did you get from being a little one to your Harvard kind of experience to here you are, giving pretty cool leadership advice to some powerful people.
Yeah, thank you so much. Well, it is already fun to have the conversation. And I would say, when I was growing up in Boston, I was probably one of the least likely people to become a meditation teacher, coming from this entrepreneurial family. Me and my sisters, all went to business school, inspired by my dad, who was an entrepreneur, very competitive, playing sports. And this just wasn't something that was on my radar. But I always, I think, had this deep curiosity about the world and that there was something more. And, when I went to college, I went to Harvard undergrad, and I went to this transcendental meditation center. I got a mantra. I thought about majoring in Sanskrit, but this just wasn't something that you did. So
you realize you need money to survive.
It's like, how's that gonna pay for life? So I got something very practical, Vinny. I got an English literature degree, which was also not very practical. And
Did
so
you know
I
that money existed at the time? Were you aware that how the economy worked, or?
No, I had to learn that lesson. Actually, so I did end up going to business school. This seemed like a way to actually make a living as well. And I went to Harvard to business school, and thinking that if you just keep going to Harvard, eventually things will work out. You'll feel good about yourself. And, I was also just very much a kind of overachieving type A perfectionist. And it was just like, what's the best? Go here, do that. And, and just sort of underneath all of that, there was, dealing with some depression and realizing that I was attracted to women, which wasn't, a thing that you also did either in the, 90s as well. So I was on this one track of success and Harvard and MBA, and on this other track of, who am I and what's life all about? Mm-hmm. And the things that I started doing while I was in business school in terms of starting to practice yoga and meditation, these are things now that seem very, kind of commonplace in business school, but were not at all something that either you talked about or did,
Sure, yeah.
certainly at a place like Harvard Business School. So I was kind of like living this double life there. And then I moved out to Los Angeles at the end of sort of late 90s. And I actually, because I thought all of the world's problems could be solved by getting another master's degree, I got a master's degree in fine arts and screenwriting. And, looking back on it, traveling all over the world now, working with companies, realizing like the importance of storytelling, realize the importance of mindfulness. It all paints a picture looking back. But at that time, there really wasn't a picture that I could see of being a compassionate leader, being a mindful leader, the role of storytelling, all of those things that were really important to me. So I was really kind of carving my path forward at that time. So I'll just pause there and see if you have any reflections.
Yeah, no, I mean, I resonate with that sort of journey because it's like I could see you just finding your passion. I feel like you're very intellectually curious, and you were constantly just looking for where looking for meaning. And I think it seems like you were drawn to the arts. In that creativity side of you, and then Harvard Business was like, well, that's a practical thing because who doesn't want to have Harvard Business on their resume? But then you went back to the fine arts world again. So it seems like that's, I don't know, my gut's saying that's where your passion is, that's where your heart is, even though.
Yeah, and I think actually my heart is really in like balancing all of these opposites. Like when I was in business school, I was sort of the creative film school person. When I was in film school, I was the more like analytical, strategic person. And so for me, the journey really has been, how can you balance these sort of seemingly opposed parts of yourselves? And I think that's really the model of leadership that we are moving into, where we integrate the thinking and the feeling and the strategy and the creative. And we can't, just have sort of one way of looking at things. We really want to try to integrate and harmonize all of those parts of ourselves.
Yeah, it seems like, and I'm not just going to be blowing smoke up your butt here, it seems like you were ahead of the time in a sense where now I think it's empowering and it's encouraged to have diverse interests, not just your field. Even in your field, for example, just like being, in any acceptance criteria of a college now, and it's probably going on for quite a while, but they want to see other extracurricular. They want to see how well-rounded you are. And maybe that was a thing for a while, but I feel like in business, back, maybe when you were in at Harvard or wherever, it was like you want to be laser focused on that thing, being someone that's. I think I read you had said this, so I don't think I'm speaking out of turn here, but you had said you were living. You said when we just spoke, you said a double life, but I had written down you were living a triple life. You said I was in Harvard Business School, I was in gay lesbian bars, and also on yoga retreats. So what? And then the host started laughing, and I wrote that down like. But it's interesting because you're just a diverse human. You have all these interests, and it's like I feel like you're trying to harmonize them, like to use your own words that you just said, and that's
totally, and
not simple.
100%. And it was, I think, also I do feel a little ahead of my time, and it's really exciting now to be able to actually harmonize and live them all, whereas before I was really needing to be very compartmentalized. It's not like I could bring those other parts of myself. There was my work life, and then there were these other parts of my life.
Right.
And I think that now, really being at Radical Candor is the first time that I feel like all of these parts of myself can shine and be honored and reflected. And that's, several decades into a working career.
Yeah, and I'm sure some hurdles and some pains and some obstacles and emotional. I mean, that's not being the first to really pioneer anything is just not easy, right? You get a little bloody, right? And then the rest of the folks kind of step
a little
through.
bloody and just tired. It's tiring.
I can imagine. Yeah. You're paddling upstream a lot. No, but it's like, again, like I say, a little bit ahead of your time, because now you hear mantras a lot like, bring your whole self to work. And I don't remember where I heard that recently, but it's not mine, but I heard that. And it really is leadership. Leaders are encouraged to bring their whole self because it brings a more personal environment to the workplace. So, you're a musician on the side, or you do X, Y, and Z on the side. Bring that to work too. Let's talk about it. Like, obviously that can't be the focus of your day to day. You have to focus on the business, but it sounds like that's more what culture building is about. And it seems like you were doing that before it was sort of cool, if you will.
Yeah, I really trying to. Sometimes, to your point, not always accepted. And so part of what, it's really interesting with the phrase, bring your whole self to work, originally with Radical Candor, which we can certainly speak about, that was one of the things that we spoke about was this idea of, how to show up at work to really bring your whole self to work. But we got feedback, especially from folks who were people of color, that actually there were some real penalties for bringing your whole self to work, that wasn't always accepted. I certainly have experienced that, getting certainly some homophobic comments and sexist comments. And so there's been some real penalties of what that means to sort of bring your whole self to work. And I think that we're moving increasingly towards that view of actually it's in our diversity of not just our backgrounds, but how we look at the world that is actually how we all get better, just sharing our own perspectives.
Right. This is embarrassing if I took a quote from the book Radical Candor and forgot where it came from. Did that come from you?
It was certainly
or from
something
Kim
we
Scott,
spoke
or?
about in workshops, and it may have originally.
Maybe that's where
I
it was
think
top
it was
of mind.
something at Google for sure as well, and it's still something
Okay.
I want the world to be a place where we can do that. But what we really focus on is having these real, sort of human relationships, and the reason why
Right.
we haven't said that as much is just because for some folks there can actually be some real harm done if you bring your whole self to work.
Right. Yeah, it's almost whole with an asterisk, right? There's a limit. We'd
And
love to
we want to get to a world where we all can, but just accepting
Yeah.
that we're not necessarily all quite there. And I've certainly had some of my own experiences like that as well.
Yeah, I'm wondering where that balance is, because I think I wrote in one of my messages. What did I say? And I feel it all the time. And I don't know, I'm just an overthinker. Again, I resonate with a lot of your
Well, welcome to
personality.
we're in the club. Welcome to
Oh my gosh, yeah, it's crazy. And
Overthinkers
it's
Anonymous.
Yeah, and super empathic. I'm an overthinker. I'm type A, and but what I notice in the workplace and just I feel like I'm trying to be more positive about it because it tends to come across negative. But I feel like so many of us are fake so often, and to various degrees, right? And you just can't say whatever comes off the top of your mind whenever you think it. There's got to be some sort of filter, just because that's just the reality of humans that maybe don't know each other very well, and things could come across the wrong way. But I just feel like the majority of how we interact with each other, whether it's at the office or at schools or even neighborhoods, it's like it shouldn't be 180 from the way you speak to your significant other, your children, your spouse when the door closes at night. It should be closer to that. And maybe there's going to always be a divide between there. But I don't know. I just sometimes I find myself going over and above to try to just be myself everywhere in every context, whether I'm with CEOs or 2-3-star admirals, or I'm with like just a buddy that I've known for 100 years and used to get drunk and pass out with. Like, I just try to be if myself is sincere and pure and just compassionate to all humans, then there shouldn't be anything in me that should come out that I shouldn't be able to just share. Occasionally I'll step in a landmine with that though, because they don't know the context, or no, I didn't mean that like that. My friends used to joke about that. It didn't mean that hurtful thing. You just took it as, and I feel terrible because, so I don't know where that balance is, but I feel like we all need to be less fake and just be more. It would still more trust in each other, and there'll be more of that. That might be just pie in the sky thinking. I don't know, but it just feels like we need more authenticity with each other.
Yeah, I hear you. And I think one of the things I've found in teaching Radical Candor has been the benefits of specificity. And so, when you talk about fake and authentic, it's sort of like we all as humans have these BS meters. And, one of the things we talk about with praise, how important praise is, and we like to say praise is specific and sincere. It's like, oh, Vinny, this podcast is so great. I love you so much. You're a genius. It's like, that's BS, like based on, it's so broad. And so part of what it is knowing yourself well enough to know, like, that core part of you, what you described it as the part of you that is so caring and that is so empathetic and that does want to connect with people. So part of it's sort of connecting to that part, and then how you reach out to someone else and say, Vinny, I so appreciate being on this podcast. Your curiosity, for example, when you shared about your own experience feeling like you don't want to be fake, that helped me connect to you and learn more about what really mattered to you. And as a result, that's inspiring me to share my own reflections of what that means, so we can go even deeper. So I think part of it is the actual like framing in which we have these conversations, which is why I think the Radical Candor model is so helpful. And then part of it is really all of that work on ourselves, and knowing that the part of us that, quote, is fake or what have you, those are defense mechanisms that we've created so that, we have this desire not to be kicked out of the tribe, to belong, and so I think somewhat being more aware of why we do the things that we do with a little bit of self-compassion. It also helps us have a little more compassion for folks when we see them putting up a barrier as well. It's like, okay, we weren't like this as kids. We would play, it's like, that's not how we're wired, but we sort of accumulate all of this on top of ourselves. And so I think it's having an awareness of that and just a little bit more compassion for ourselves and for other folks. Like, those were defense mechanisms to protect us.
100%. Yep. That makes total. Yeah. Yeah. Yep. So
especially at work.
Yeah. I mean, work is, the office work, whatever we do to generate income in this capitalist society, it takes majority of our time, right? That's where I don't know, for me, it's where we grow up, for most of us, we grow up, we're kids out of college. If we follow the normal trajectory and, you're a kid out of college, you don't know what you don't know. And then you get into the workplace, and there's so much time, especially if you're driven, there's so much time spent at that workplace with those work folks, with those work people. It's really a place where you develop. So yeah, especially at work is exactly right, to summarize your phrase. So what I realized, we didn't really introduce Radical Candor, and that's really how I found you. And so I'd like, so quick background there, I reached out to, I think it was you directly or Kim Scott, who actually wrote the Radical Candor book originally. I went through a little bit of I would call it a sort of existential sort of maybe crisis, maybe, Vinny, and anyway, I went through this, I have many ones along the way.
Wither Vinny, question mark.
That's right. But this was a larger one where I really had to just take a step back and evaluate things, right? I was going, it turned out it was a very positive experience overall, but if for a while I didn't know what the hell was going on. I was like, I need to dig into this, right? And as I went through that, I spent several weeks reading a bunch of books, and I have really good friends, that have gone through similar things themselves. And they gave me a list of several books that really helped me a ton, and one of which was Radical Candor. And it really, it opened my eyes to at the I'd say top level. It seems like such a simple idea, such a simple concept. Then you kind of unpack it, and it goes, okay, there's nuance. There's a lot going on here as to how a person, a group, a family, or an organization could potentially think they're using these tenets correctly, but really not at all. Or so anyway, I'll kind of let you explain what Radical Candor is and how you got involved in it, I guess.
Sure. Yeah, and I think what you're saying is 100% correct, which is that it is a really simple idea. When we say Radical Candor, it's at the highest level, it's this very simple idea that we can care personally about the people. It's focused at work, but by the way, it relates to all humans. So like to your point, it can work in all relationships, but that we can care personally about the people that we work with at the same time that we challenge them directly. And often what we'll do is we'll share stories of when this kind of thing happens. But the sort of origin story that Kim Scott, who you mentioned, wrote the book, was when she was walking her dog in New York on a very crowded street, and she loved this dog so much so that invariably she never taught the dog how to do anything. And so it's a busy street, the dog runs out in the middle of the road, and she pulls the dog back just barely, like the taxi, whirring by, and her heart's racing, and this guy just out of the blue says, I can see you really love that dog. And that was all that person needed to do to sort of connect in this like human way. Like, I see, like, you really love this dog. And then he said, but you're going to get that dog killed if you don't teach it how to sit. And then, he says sit, and the dog sat, and, and so it's sort of a quick story. And I'm not saying we have talked to people the way we talk to our dogs, but it's this idea that sometimes when we sort of care so much about people, we don't want to hurt their feelings. We don't tell them the difficult thing, or we go the other side, what Kim is called obnoxious aggression, where we just say whatever the heck we want to say. But this goes to, what I think my sort of the reason I'm here is to integrate, to balance. So balancing, integrating the care personally, the challenge directly, and especially at work, we feel like we have to do one of these things or another. And the penalties of these mistakes that we make when we're not practicing radical candor, it can be so helpful to understand. And just, I'm happy to kind of walk through the mistakes that we make. But one of the reasons why radical candor, I think, took off as an idea was because it was so simple. But one of the challenges was that people took the phrase radical candor and ended up kind of weaponizing it into like, oh, this means I can say whatever the heck I want.
Yeah.
And then I can just use some air quotes and say, like, in the spirit of radical candor, you're an idiot. That was a terrible presentation. You'll never get anywhere. It's like, no. That's not the spirit of radical candor. That is the spirit of obnoxious aggression, where you're just challenging someone. You're basically acting like a jerk. It's like if somebody has spinach in their teeth and you're in a meeting and you just say, like, throw a toothbrush and you're disgusting, and, you just make it very clear they have spinach, but you've ruined the relationship.
Right.
And so I
You might
think
be challenging them directly, but you're obviously not caring for them.
you've left out
both.
the caring part.
Right.
And what's really interesting about that, and one of the things that I think was so helpful was creating this sort of 2x2. So you can imagine sort of a vertical axis and a horizontal axis. And so if, challenge directly is on the horizontal axis and on the vertical is care personally, sort of that bottom right where you're challenging but not caring is obnoxious aggression. And what's really interesting about that one is that it's the only other quadrant besides radical candor where the person actually knows what the mistake is. So they know they have spinach in their teeth, but you've now humiliated them and you've blown up the relationship. And so I think a lot of what we've seen, certainly in a more like top-down, sort of more command and control type of business organizations, where obnoxious aggression has worked. In other words, like the jerks, quote unquote, there's been a model where acting like a jerk can actually get you some success because people know what the problem is. It just, people feel terrible, and it has a lot of longer term consequences. The other thing I'll say is I made a mistake, which is I said the jerks. We have all acted like jerks. One of the things we like to say when we share this in a workshop is like, use this framework not like a sort of Myers-Briggs personality test, but more as a way to guide conversations to a better place. So if I realize I'm kind of acting like a jerk, it's like, oh, I need to be more caring here in this conversation, or vice versa.
Yeah. And I'll put that, visually I have the quad chart in my head. You just explained it, audibly, which is great. I appreciate that. But I'll link that quad chart.
Yeah, it can be helpful for folks to just sort of like see it and exactly.
Yeah. Now, would you say, I think these kind of put what I put in my notes here. I'm thinking, I'm trying to think where am I mostly that I've been, and I went through a lot of introspection on that, literally staring at that quad chart, and it's like, wow, a lot of my issues have been I'm often in that, that ruinous empathy, what's ruinous empathy, right?
Ruinous empathy, where we're caring and we're not
left
challenging.
Quadrant, where it's like it's hard to hurt people's feelings sometimes. But one thing you brought up, because in the example of the spinach in the teeth example you gave, that would be an example of me not telling you that you have spinach in your teeth just before you go up to give a presentation, because I don't want to hurt your feelings, but yet now there's,
now I just gave a presentation. So, exactly. Right. And it's, I will do this exercise, so ruinous empathy, which, by the way, I would say, we all act in these different sort of, there's three mistakes that we can make where we're either, caring and not challenging. We call that ruinous empathy. We're not caring. We're not challenging. We call that manipulative insincerity. And then obnoxious aggression, which I just spoke about, where we're challenging and not caring. But to get back to ruinous empathy, that's certainly the mistake that I make most of the time, that we see a lot of folks make most of the time, where we care so much that we don't say the hard thing. And for me, part of why I am so passionate about teaching Radical Candor is because a really important relationship of mine at work, I basically blew up because I was so afraid to give this guy tough feedback. And it all came to a head when we had a new boss and there was a new assignment, and I had to say, if you don't do this, your job is on the line. And he was like, why am I just hearing that my job is on the line?
Right.
And it was all because of my own not willingness to hurt his feelings. But I think where you were going, Vinny, is like, what's really interesting, and this is why self-awareness is so important, it was, yes, I was afraid to hurt his feelings. And I also didn't want to deal with the discomfort of his emotion, of my not being sort of like the one that everyone likes. And so much of that work is really, it can be just as much about sort of protecting myself and my own kind of self-concept, my own comfort, as it is really helping this person. So yes, I don't want to tell you you have spinach, but I also am just hoping someone else will do it, because like I'm just I'm really busy and
Right.
I don't really want to deal with your stress, and then it's easier not to say anything.
Yeah, no, that, and I put that specifically in my notes to you because I thought that was, again, seemingly so simple, but you could hide behind, the ruinous empathy quadrant saying, well, I'm just someone who doesn't like hurt people's feelings. So
Right.
you kind of spin it in a way that you're actually you're an extra good person, and you kind of have that mini justification in your head and you kind of move on. And I probably have done that in the past myself, and just because you're so busy, you just want to move on to, okay, let's move on to the next thing, and then I'll try better next time. But I don't think I can do that anymore officially, because I had it in writing when I read your content. It's like that could be masked by the real reasons, which is you don't want to deal with the uncomfortable situation, because it's going to be uncomfortable for you, not just for them. And you kind of want, maybe you're a people pleaser, you want people to like you. And if you tell people this bad news, even though you're being compassionate and candid, you have that fear that they're not going to like you as much. So it does get back from it kind of on the spectrum of selfless to selfish. I feel like it gets back to more selfish, where, hey, you're almost looking out for yourself here too by not telling that person that they have spinach in their teeth. So there's really no reason, if you can get there, to not be in that radical candid quadrant. That should be the ultimate goal.
Yeah, that is the goal. And we're going to mess up all the time because we're complex folks. And I think, part of just having that self-awareness, the way that I work through it, first of all, I teach radical candor to hold myself accountable to practicing radical candor. Because yes, I am I'd like to say recovering perfectionist, recovering people pleaser and all of that. But I really think about, if I really want to be helpful, which is what is my ultimate motivation and goal? If I am someone that really cares about other people, then I will do this in service of helping them, seeing them succeed. And just, a quick story where we have a partnership with Second City Works, and we were doing, they're an improv group. And so we were doing a workshop and working with a couple of improvisers. And this guy came out of the restroom. We were just about to go on stage. This was, before the pandemic. And his fly was down, and we're about to go on stage. And I was like, okay, well, who's going to tell him that his fly is down? Because we're about to go on stage. And I'm like, you are the person between him and the stage. And by the way, you're teaching radical candor. But I just it's that human nature of you're sort of looking around for someone else to do the hard thing. So I pulled him to the side.
I wish it was just spinach. I wish it was just
exactly.
spinach.
Now it's getting harder. It's getting more complicated, right? Spinach would have been a lot easier. So I pulled him to the side. I told him, and he was an improviser. So of course he was hilarious about it. But the reason why I share that story is just to acknowledge, we are going against how we are wired, right? We all want people to like us. It's like this whole, if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all. But the other thing is, one of the things I love about improv is that before you go on stage, you say to everyone, got your back. And there's no better way to demonstrate to someone got your back than saying, I'm not going to let you go on stage with your fly down. And I expect that you would do the same thing for me. So that's how you start to really build trust. And yes, it's uncomfortable, but what I've found is the more you start to practice it, the more comfortable you become with what seems to be uncomfortable.
Yeah. I've noticed I've been conscious of doing it, I would say, in various, even before knowing the term, before looking up your work and Kim's work. I had to kind of reflect on it. When I truly am, when I truly do bring something up that's hard, but that I've done it the right way and it came across compassionately, but folks, the person could see that I was really truly sincere about it and it was something I needed to talk about. It every single time has worked out well. It really has. If maybe not right in the moment, but over the longer term, it has been a net positive. Where if I just ignored it or didn't confront it, it usually tends to end. It seems easier at the moment, but then long term, it's just things go awry. It's like I wish I had adjust that upstream.
It's totally like the, human desire, like, oh, we'll just sort of kick this can down the road. And
Yep.
now all we can think of is the thing that we haven't said. And now we're getting more resentment. And I really appreciate what you said, because one of the things that we like to share in our workshops is that, most of the time this actually does go smoothly. But because we have these negativity biases, we sort of over index on the times when it doesn't go as smoothly. And the other thing is, when it doesn't go smoothly, that's not a bad thing. I think we're so afraid of dealing with someone else's emotion or them not hearing us. It's actually, how do we respond in the moment? Let's say we say something, one of the things I know that was interesting to you is this idea that radical candor is measured not at, my mouth as the speaker, but at the other person's ear. So it's sort of this idea of impact and intention. It's like, well, my intention was to be kind and clear. It's like when Vinny, you say, no, like actually that landed in a way, it was actually kind of obnoxious for me. That's how it's like, oh, wow, tell me more, like that. I really was trying to be kind and clear. How could I have made that more caring or more clear for you? Because we're not going to, you and I are different people. I'm not going to know how, this is what kind and clear means to me, but it could land very differently for you. So having those conversations and how you show up, especially when someone is feeling some emotion around it, to meet the emotion with compassion, that's actually how we build our relationships. And I will say, just, working at Radical Candor and having some of these more difficult conversations and being willing to have these conversations is actually, it truly is creating the deepest relationships of my working career.
Yeah, you had mentioned, you mentioned direct reports a lot in some of the talks you had given. And one thing, maybe it's more of a question. It's, you have to manage the personality, and what you just said sort of, I would say, or message to the personality, and what you had said kind of, I think articulates that where it's not really, it's not where it comes out of your mouth. It's how I hear it. Right. I think that's paraphrasing, but so it's almost like, and maybe that's just why being a good, effective leader is so difficult, because it is a lot of work. If you have 20 direct reports, 30, for example, and you have to be radically candid to each of them at different times, you have to know them enough to know how they're going to receive the message. So you can't just message it the same way for all 20, 30 people, because they're all, to your point, we're all different. We all have different biases, fears, insecurities, et cetera, strengths, weaknesses. It is like, wow, man, that's exhausting to really be that effective with each individual of your people that, and because a good leader would care about them. And how do I make you, one of my direct reports, a better contributor to this work, to this environment, to the family, whatever it might be. It's like, do you have to really, I guess, adjust your message to the list, to the receiver each and every time?
And I mean, even what you were just saying, 20, 30 people, that is a lot, because and part of it might be, is like, even just organizationally, are you structured in a way that's actually, supportive? Because when we talk about practicing radical candor, like, how do you put this into practice? First of all, it's when it comes to feedback, and it's more than just about feedback. It's how you run your how you run your meetings, how you have career conversations. Where do you want to go? But specifically about feedback, the model that we have, first of all, is that these are one-on-one conversations. Like there's ways that you lead meetings and are with your team, but this is really about building a one-on-one relationship. And before you even get into giving criticism, which is often what we first think of when it comes to feedback, but we actually want to start by getting feedback, especially if we're the manager. And so, starting by having some go-to questions to get feedback that are not yes or no, that are not like, am I doing a good job? Yes, Amy, you're the best manager ever, but really trying to get at ways such as like, where did you need more of my time last week? Or where did you need less of me? Which are, one great question. Like, I tend to be more of a micromanager. So asking a question like, where was I involved where you actually didn't need me? Or Jason, who's our CEO, is more of a, work on your own kind of person. So a good question for him is, where did you actually need me in the past week? And different people you work with will need more or less of you. And you don't know unless you ask those questions. And then we want to actually give that specific and sincere praise, and then moving on to criticism. So I think part of it is that we are seeing your job as a manager. Sometimes people think like, oh, that's just sort of this extra stuff. But no, it's actually building that relationship and taking the time, and it doesn't need to be tons and tons of time. It can just be a few minutes, in your one-on-ones, scheduling a few minutes at the end of a
Yeah.
meeting so that you can check in.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
having that dedicated one-on-one time is important.
Yeah, it's true because managing or building a culture, building that relationship. Say me as a quote unquote manager, it's not. It could easily be looked at as not part of the job. I'm because I have tasks to do, actual work to do, which sometimes that's considered almost like on the side. But you're right. A good leader realizes that's not on the side. That is directly in line with what you should be doing. Yeah. Another thing you said that's, you know, it's sort of related, sprinkled into what we're saying. I just kind of wrote a note here. It's when, because I was thinking when we were talking through like what are companies doing well, what they aren't doing, and one thing that sort of jumped out at me, and again, you guys may have said this, you or Kim, in one of your talks you have done, but the bajillion books I read in the past year, it's kind of like if every meeting you have in an organization just goes well, right? And I think it was in the 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. I think that's the book that I read. I think that's where this came from. But if every meeting sort of goes well, it's like, oh, how was the meeting? Or you're in it, and there was no conflict. There was just everyone talking, everyone seemingly agree, and then they just kind of disperse. In my opinion, that wasn't a meeting. That was just like a kumbaya session, right? I mean, there's, now if you have occasionally those sprinkled in, fair enough. I guess there's some of them that everyone just agreed, but I feel like when that happens, most of the time, then somebody wasn't being quote unquote radically candid about something. I feel like you can't have 5, 6, 10, it'd be the one company ever that had like everyone just on the same page agreeing, right? I don't think so. It's almost like there should be that healthy conflict in almost every time you get 4 or 5 people in the room. And if radical candor is the underpinnings of why that would, be the case, then good conflict would arise. You'd get sort of a, try to work towards some buy-in between the members, even though people might disagree, but it might get a little uncomfortable at times. But isn't that sort of the whole goal of solving complex problems as businesses and organizations and people, right? Anyway, just going to get your thoughts there. It's like if meetings just keep going well, it's like, what are we doing here?
Yeah, I think we want to, and realizing that, different perspectives is really what we're looking for, and that's how we grow. And in terms of these one-on-one kind of feedback conversations, we do call that, this is really about sharing my perspectives. Like, here's how I see it. How do you see it? When it comes to meetings and sort of this broader idea of what we call at Radical Candor, getting stuff done, we're actually right now on our own podcast going through, Kim created this sort of get shit done wheel, if I'm allowed to use the phrase. But, I think part of the problem with meetings is that people don't know what sort of meeting you're in. And meetings, making sure that we know what the point of the meeting is. So there's a whole process by which, we recommend getting stuff done. First is listening. Like, what are your team's ideas about the kinds of, results, the kinds of projects that they're focused on? Then clarifying, especially your role as a manager, especially in those one-on-one meetings, is helping your team member clarify their ideas, whether it's a new project, whether it's, part of a broader initiative, but clarifying those ideas, because then they're going to move those ideas into a debate. And so a debate meeting is a meeting where, the metaphor that we often talk about is this idea of this rock tumbler that I think Steve Jobs, talked about at Apple, where like this is where, with clarifying and debating, we're getting more to the jewel of the idea. And if people don't feel safe to have a healthy debate, and a healthy debate isn't you're an idiot or this and that's about like taking different perspectives, bringing in your listening, making sure that everyone has a voice, but also being very clear that this is a meeting where we're debating ideas. We will have a separate discussion where we're deciding on what we're doing. And I think often what happens is some people in a meeting think that we're in a deciding, and we're like, why are we still talking about that? So being really clear about what we're doing. And then once we, have decided it, then starting to persuade the folks that maybe weren't in the meeting so that we can execute and learn from there. But if you don't do all of these steps, listen and clarify, debate, decide, persuade, and then actually execute and learn from it, people are going to feel like, I wasn't included. I don't know why we made that decision. I should have been in that decision. They're not going to have had a chance where we all could have actually debated. And, I think one of the best ways to have a healthy debate is actually to take the perspective of maybe the other side that you're trying to debate from. If you start getting sort of too attached and it's too heated, it's like, oh, well, Vinny was talking about this. Now let me take what Vinny was talking about and can flip. So that can sometimes be a really healthy way to do that. And so that we can have a discussion. The whole point is we want to get to the best idea, to the best outcome. It's not, whether it's Amy's idea or Vinny's idea, it's really about so that we as a group can get to sort of that best idea.
I think everyone would agree with that on paper, but when you add actual personalities and human and all of our flaws and which insecurities and egos, and it just seems to dissolve so quickly. When I'm in meeting, because I know I've had to grow in that where I'm a lot less insecure than I was, like just as a person. I just know I am. It's been something, and I tell people this, like, you really? They've known me for years. Never would have guessed it. It's like, well, trust me, I hide it well. Very, very insecure. Much better now, but it's still there. But I know now, which was never true in the past. And when I'm in meetings now, and I say meetings both at work, at home, dealing with real estate people, have rental property, et cetera, whatever it might be. I tend to have a lot of ideas that I want to throw them out there. So I do a lot of talking, and then occasionally everyone's like, yeah, okay, sounds good. And then we hang up, and I feel like it wasn't very productive. I just have a feeling like it wasn't as brilliant. There's got to be holes in what I just said, right? I wish. So half of me is kind of like, okay, it was easy, and then I go on with my day. The other half of me is like, I don't feel like there was a point to that meeting because you could have just said all that stuff, I don't know, into the mirror and then just went about your day. There was no, and occasionally we'll get a meeting where, and this actually just happened a couple of weeks ago, to be honest. I went on a 15-minute summary of my vision for certain tasks that I was working on, and this was we'll call him a customer for the sake. Have a great rapport with him, great relationship with this person, so it was awesome. But he said, Vinny, I'm looking at this completely differently. I don't agree with anything I just heard. And so I said, okay, awesome. Let's it was fine. And come to find out, we were much more aligned than he thought. But there was a couple real good nuances that he dug into, and I said, oh, you know what, you're right about that. I missed that point, and that changed my opinion about a lot of things downstream. So I remember hanging up, go, wow, that got uncomfortable for 30% of the meeting. Was pretty uncomfortable in an okay way, because again, I have a great relationship with this person, but I ended it feeling very legitimately, sincerely productive, because I was like, idea shot down, 20% was held up, 30% was shot down. We added 50%. We came out of it literally as a team with buy-in, and we took all the best ideas from everyone. And so it was. That just doesn't happen enough, I guess, is my point.
I love that story. And, I think this is why really getting into like what's happening in those moments. And, there's a whole section in the book, and we talk about this in our podcast as well, like sort of loud listening versus quiet listening. I'm more of a quiet listener. I love to ask questions. Kim talks a lot about loud listening. And, examples of like just the story that you were sharing, like, let's say you do your presentation. It's like, I want, 5 reasons why this is the crappiest presentation you've ever heard, or, sort of soliciting that feedback of let's poke holes in it. Let's do this. And so it does go back to our kind of identity and our willingness to not be so attached to, our identity as our ideas in a way. It's
right.
It's like what I'm attached to is like, I want us to get to the greatest thing. And it's like, I'm throwing these ideas out, not to say, oh, I'm the smartest person in the room or this and that, but actually because this is going to help us get to something even better. So in my mind, that story that you shared, your openness to getting those other perspectives. And by the way, the more we start to do that, the more it's like, oh, like I welcome that, because that's actually how I didn't feel like this a waste of time meeting, which is 100%. Most of what you're talking, that's when things are really, really healthy. So I think it's a fantastic story. And to just bring it back a little bit to what we were talking about at the beginning of mindfulness and emotional intelligence. And I would just say, I would not be teaching Radical Candor if I did not have a mindfulness and a meditation practice and doing all of that work. And I would say, from what I hear you saying, is that you in that meeting and being willing to entertain these other things and let's poke holes in it is a result of growth and work that you've done. And so that's why I'm so passionate about doing this work on ourselves, so that we can actually be in those moments and realize like, okay, I'm noticing this part of me is feeling really pissed off or feeling, defensive. And like, that's okay. But connecting back to what we really want, which is like, gosh, I really want us to get to, what's the best possible outcome? How can I help? How can I help other people clarify their thinking? And, and I would not have been in that place 25 years ago. I still, it's not like there's never moments of defensiveness, but it's having a quicker return time to sort of get back to, wait, why am I here? I want to be helpful. I want us as a group to get to sort of the best outcome we can.
Yeah. And I think another thing too is it's almost, not almost, I think it directly, I've always believed in, and at times it's very stressful, and I think it's probably taken years off my life, but following the path of most resistance is usually the best way to go. Like the path of most resistance is like, if your alarm goes off at 5, 6 a.m., the path of most resistance is to get up and go for that run. But that's better. The path of most resistance is not having those extra drinks that you want because you're stressed. But long run, that's better, right? Taking the harder job with the most stress. Now there's a limit there, but is going to get you more visibility, more responsibility. Usually, the easier path is just is not rewarding. Long term, it's just going to. So it's almost like if and this is kind of what I've talked to some folks at work about, and folks that I've directly mentored. It's like, because they've said, wow, you always seem to be in these meetings where I don't know how you deal with all that pressure. You're giving these presentations, sometimes the whether it's demos or just presentations remotely, whatever it might be. And you're stepping into lines then, a bunch of stuff you couldn't control, but you just have to be, you're basically on the hook for, taking one for the team. How do you, and it's just like, I try to instill in them, look, this is, if we're all just being candid and we're all, attacking the ideas and not the person and just trying to be productive, you should never take it personally, right? That's another kind of book that I'm reading, How Not to Take Things Personally, right? Which is another really good sort of area of growth that I'm trying to work on. But this is getting more into like leadership recommendations and things like that. But I think circling back to the example I gave and how you respond, it's like if folks that are maybe coming up and they want to get into more leadership roles, I think their ability to be in those harder situations and not run from them will kind of propel them in their career, if that's stuff they want. So, but it's just like, so the quicker you can get, I mean, it took me years, right? I mean, that's not saying I did this overnight, but it took me years to like not run away from those uncomfortable feelings. Like, hey, kind of almost laugh, like, oh, you disagree with that? Okay, awesome. Tell me why. Let's talk through it. And occasionally you get someone that gets a little personal and they're just not good people. But I think they're few and far between. I think for the most part, people are just afraid of having their ideas attacked. And then, like you said, something really important, I think, we do get really attached to our ideas and our identity. Our ideas become our identity, and that then it's like, oh, no, it is personal because they don't like the fact that I thought we should do X, Y, and Z. It's like, no, that's just an idea you had. That's not your identity is completely separate, completely decoupled. And that's an important point.
You've raised two things. I want to make sure to address them. One is about the taking things personally, and the other one is about sort of the most resistance. On the taking things personally, for me, I tend to see things so much in paradox. And one of the things that we say in our workshops is about the sort of harm of the phrase, like, oh, don't take it personally, when we say that to someone else. And the challenge with that phrase, when we say it to someone else, is because we are basically telling that person how we want them to feel, and we cannot control how they're going to feel. And most likely, and we do take things personally. And by taking things personally, I mean invested in, like, I want to do a good job. I just spent 6 months on this and I do feel really invested. So I think when we say that to other people, it can actually be harmful in the sense of, first of all of a sudden, if they weren't taking it personally, they are now. Like, that's just human nature. Yeah. It's also like saying, like, oh, no offense, but, and then you sort of like, right. It's one of those phrases. So I try not to be too didactic, but I really think that phrase can kind of blow up in your face. But what the paradox of that on the not taking things personally is what we were talking about with this sort of idea and identity, which is that, there's all of these kind of phenomena happening, our thoughts and, what's happening in our body and our emotions. And then ultimately we sort of see all of this as a referendum like of self, like about Amy. It's like, do they like me? Don't they like me? Am I a genius?
Yeah.
Like, we're sort of like mediating it all. And so I think that's what we mean by not taking it personally for ourselves. In other words, of like, I am still, whether I gave a great presentation or it didn't go as well, or I did my PowerPoint and then all of a sudden people are saying, there's a lot of problems with that idea. The way that I interpret not taking personally is like, is about exactly that sort of ideas versus identity, that like I can feel enough as who I am, apart from sort of, maybe how it's landing for other people. And I think it's about what kind of identity you're cultivating. Am I cultivating sort of this smaller fear-based identity that's about, do people like me, and how, all of this sort of all the thoughts that we think about ourselves, or is it sort of this larger identity that's actually much more connected to what you were saying, like the non sort of, we all have this sort of like greater self, like sort of what would my best self do? And that's the part that I think doesn't take things personally. And so it's like having a little compassion for the part of us that does, because it's like that's still that little kid that's like, oh, that didn't feel so good.
Yeah, I want kids to
So
want
I
to
don't know
play
how
on the
that lands
playground.
for you.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
100%. Yeah,
Yeah.
100%.
So I think that's one of those paradoxes. And, for me, it's a life's work, because we sort of see everything through our own lens. And some of it's like getting out of our own stories. And then,
Yes.
this idea of resistance, like, that's just another thing I've focused on a lot. And I know the firewalking was interesting to you. But when I look at everything, for me, is like, it's a growth opportunity. It's a learning opportunity. I think we have that in common. And there's sort of this idea of like, what's your kind of stretch zone? What's your growth zone? And then what's kind of your panic zone, right?
Yeah,
And it's
yeah,
like,
yeah.
especially in workshops, certain people will have what could be a stretch, or, a growth zone for one person could be a panic for someone else. And so I think part of it's knowing those parts of yourself of like, what's going to push myself to a limit so I'm going to keep growing, versus what is just so far out of the realm that like I'm just going to totally shut down. And so for me, that's kind of how I look at it, is like, if my goal is to keep growing, what's sort of that next thing out of my growth zone? And back to another little chart with an X and a Y axis. I'm not going to pronounce his name correctly, but you might know him, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi something, who created the term flow. Was looking at this idea of flow. And the way that I like to describe it, and a really easy way to do it at work, is to sort of think about your resources and your challenges on sort of an X and Y axis. And if your resources meet your challenges, then you can kind of be in that flow state. If your challenges are so much more than your resources, you're just going to get totally stressed and you're going to check out. And if your resources are so much bigger than your challenges, then you're just going to be bored and, and just sort of punching in the clock. And so that was when I would, often work with CEOs and teaching mindfulness. It can just be a really helpful way, like both for you individually, but also for your team members. If your team member each week keeps coming in and their challenges are way bigger than their resources, whether that's their time, whether that's their skill set, they need training, whether that's other team members, then it's a quick way to find out like, oh, I gotta bump up either the resources or take something off their plate.
Yeah, that is a simple. It seems like I love that. You just need two axes and you can describe
two
anything.
Axes.
Like.
Just throw any of the world's problems in there. That's all you learn in business school.
Yeah. What did that ax? What did each axis cost you? No, I won't say that. With the tuition.
Exactly. It's about like $50,000 per axis.
I think Harvard does Groupon. I think you used the Groupon. You said.
I just use a Groupon.
Yeah. So Amy, I know we're into it about an hour. We didn't really talk about the mindfulness a ton. I know you sprinkled in there, but I guess maybe just touch on a couple points, maybe because again, I think you've done a great job of just sort of. And again, I've done this I've stumbled into sort of mindfulness, and it's not like I practice it daily or anything, but I do like the idea of being mindful at times, and I try to remind myself of, take a deep breath, think about why you're feeling what you're feeling, step outside yourself, meta, whatever you want to say. It truly does make a huge difference in almost any circumstance you're going through. So and you said this in a lot of your talks, how, leaders should leverage mindfulness to be better leaders, and I guess what are some basic tenets of mindfulness that we all should embrace, and maybe leaders in particular?
Yeah, I mean, part of it is just, getting clear on a definition. There's a variety of definitions, but, this idea of this paying attention in the present moment. So there's an idea of attention and being intentional about it. Like I am intentionally paying attention in the present moment. So we're not sort of all out in the future, which tends to cause, sort of worry, and we're not in the past and we're replaying other conversations. So we're in the present moment. And what are we focusing on? We're focusing on, our body, emotions, sensations, our thoughts. And we also are cultivating an attitude. And I think that's really important, especially for leaders of curiosity, of, typically non-judgmental, but really being curious and kind with ourselves. And so I think one of the ways, and look, I knew about mindfulness a long time. I kept buying books thinking, this was like 30 years ago. I just figured I'd buy a few books. It's like, no, you actually have to practice, right? Because we have to rewire our brains. Yeah. Our brains, left to their own devices, are going to be either in the future or the past. There was a study out of Harvard where, 47% of the time our minds are either in the past or the future. And what happens when we pay attention in the present? So part of it's like, job one is to start to pay attention. If we don't have the ability to train our attention and develop focus as a leader, we're just totally at the whims of whatever email is coming in, whatever sort of urgent request is coming in. So for me, that is reactive, foundational, especially now, is like, you've got to train your attention. And then as we train our attention, we start to realize there's actually, so there's like a focused attention part of mindfulness, which is really important. And we see that, in athletes, and this idea of flow. Mindfulness actually enables flow. But there's also this broader open awareness. And that's where we start to realize, if I'm leading a meeting and I'm noticing what's happening with Vinny, but I'm also noticing what's happening. I was like, oh, this person hasn't spoken as much, and maybe people are actually feeling kind of exhausted. You're sort of able to pick up on the whole group as well. Yeah. So being able to have both focused attention and an open awareness. And I think, the next most important thing is developing, as we develop our own self-awareness, which mindfulness enables, it helps us develop empathy and compassion. And so as we tune into, gosh, this is hard for me, I start to realize, like, oh, this is probably hard for the other folks I work with. And so that I can be both mindful as well as a compassionate leader, which is that I am going to be able to take the perspective to listen to what folks have to say. And this goes to exactly what you were modeling in that meeting, which is that as a leader, can I start to create a little bit of space from whatever that stimulus that is coming at me to my response, so that I'm not going to go from that first sort of knee-jerk response to, we're going to do this, but to actually be willing to create a little bit of space so that I can make a more discerning next step, a little bit more strategic. And it's very counterintuitive, because I think most leaders want to go right to the first response. And sometimes giving ourselves permission to sort of pause, to create a little bit of space so that we can make a more informed decision. And not just from our thoughts, but also from our emotions and sort of all of these different senses that we're picking up on.
It makes total sense. Yeah. And again, so it's funny how you looking back, I mean, you're kind of concluding our conversation. A lot of the stuff that you were doing in the 80s, I guess, you were getting into a lot of this stuff, and I take good credit. A lot of folks were, but it was almost considered, not. Why are you getting into all that spiritual crap, mindfulness, all this stuff that was like considered to be not what the people that were productive members of society were doing? Those are for those, I don't know, tree huggers, whatever the term was at the day, the people that just wanted to sit around. And, it was, I mean, I grew up in blue collar New England, so I remember those comments and that sentiment, right? And you kind of sort of grew up, and you traveled more, but now you come full circle, and everyone's embracing, oh, well, they were all right. They were right. Like, we can't, you can't just sit in a forest and love the forest and not, love the trees and not actually.
You have to love the trees and the forest, right? Exactly.
Right. And actually going to work. You got to do both. But I think that's kind of what we're seeing now. It's you could be in, major leadership positions, the CEOs, the whatever, the C-suite folks, moving the needle economically, but also embracing this, the spiritual side of things, whether it's religion or other, or whether it's just understanding yourself better. It's no longer this weird thing that you and others, when you were coming up, if you will use that term lightly, had to go through. It's almost embraced. It's encouraged. It's wow. That
Yeah.
CEO is extra. He can deal with extra stress because he does yoga at night, or he practices mindfulness, or she does So it's. I'm glad I feel like that's progress in a good way.
I think it's huge progress. And just as a data point, I was one of the first 30 certified teachers of the Search Inside Yourself program, which was developed at Google, to really bring mindfulness and emotional intelligence to people at Google. And then they started creating this other institute to bring it outside the world. So about 10 years ago, I started teaching mindfulness to CEOs. And there was, to your point, this sort of, what do I need this for? And needing to have so much of the science behind it, because it was like, here, look, this is what's going to happen. And if you train your attention, this is actually going to change your brain. And here's what, emotional intelligence means for leaders. So all of these things that we had to kind of back up with the science and the research are now more accepted. And people realize, oh, I do need to practice this, and not just to manage sort of stress and burnout and depression and anxiety, but actually to optimize for innovation and for more creative problem solving and for more teamwork and psychological safety, Amy Edmondson's work at Harvard Business School. So I think all of these things, that it's like, if things aren't going well for you, this will help, but also if things are going well, that will help you optimize even more. And especially when so much information is coming in, I think it's not just like a nice to have, it's a must have, so that you can actually really have more discernment about, what is the best decision in this moment, and to be a little more comfortable with the uncertainty, because there's a lot of uncertainty right now. And I think having these practices can help us get a little bit more of a solid footing when it feels like there's not much to grab onto.
100%. Yep. Very well said. Amy, this is awesome. I feel like we could go another 4 hours, but where could folks find you?
Sure. Well, we can find me on Radical Candor. So head to radicalcandor.com if you're interested in working with us, especially listen to our podcast. And you can also find me on Twitter at Amy Sandler. And I am on Instagram, Evolve Be Love. EVOLVEBELOVE for all the tree huggers out there. That's for you. It's really funny, actually, speaking of trees, now like forest bathing is a thing. It's like, these have always been practices. And now it's like, now that there's research, people realize like, oh, being in nature, like as humans, connecting with nature is actually like, get away from your video camera for a minute.
It is true. And
nature.
Yeah, because I do remember. Like I was joking before. I do remember hearing it growing up. It was more of a condescending tone from a lot of circles that I grew up with.
Yeah,
it really
absolutely.
Just was. I'm sure I used it too.
Yeah.
In fact, I know I did. I don't want to be. I want to be honest here and candid. And it's like now it's like just going into the forest on a hike is the most amazing feeling. It's like why would anyone like I don't want to come out. I don't want to come out.
Yeah, it's like this is where it's at. Awesome. I really appreciate that, and I think part of it is that I share your feeling of inspiration that like we are as we collectively realize like, oh, we are all connected, and we are part of nature. And I think, especially like the benefit, you and I would not be connecting if we didn't have this technology. And yet we can sort of remind us like, oh, wow, it actually does feel really good to go for a hike. And so maybe it's next time we'll do this on a hike in the trees somewhere, Vinny.
That'd be cool. Hey, if I'm over next time out in the
come, you'll see. I'll give you some palm trees.
Well, Amy, so lastly, you have a book coming out. Is that true, or where's that at?
Well, I have a book that is in process. I finished first draft, and I am working on the second draft. And so all of the things that we've been talking about, sharing some stories and tips, and really benefiting. Kim Scott has been such an inspiration with her ability to write books that really make a difference, and just the power of sharing our own stories. I think what you do on this podcast, the more we hear from different perspectives, people sharing their stories, I want to help people feel like, what, maybe we were enough all along and didn't need to be quite so hard on ourselves.
I know. That's yep. Amen. Well, that's a great closer right there. And it was great talking to you. It really was. Have a great weekend.
I really enjoyed it, Vinny.